The Seattle Kraken extend a key player and their head coach. The Washington Capitals look for a way back into the playoffs. Will Max Pacioretty be ready? And the Arizona Coyotes hope to take the next step toward respectability. We've got all that and a lot more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. And you can now also hear us on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. It is great to welcome back to the show a familiar voice and face for Locked On NHL listeners. She is the host of Locked On Kraken and also does our bi-weekly women's hockey spotlight here on Locked On NHL, Erica Ayala. And Erica, how you doing? It's been a busy week for the Kraken.
Yes, it sure has been. We got a contract extension with our first ever head coach, and we avoided arbitration with Vince Dunn. So we finally got some movement here in the offseason.
Let's start with the head coaching extension. I mean, Dave Hakstol took this team further than most experts anticipated they would go in year two. What are his biggest strengths as a coach that got him and earned him this extension?
Definitely building culture. We talk a lot on Locked On Kraken, and the last episode that we had really breaking down the Dave Hakstol deal, we were talking about that he created a culture. And you know, he was also very open about when he was hired with the Seattle Kraken and recently with his extension that he's very grateful to have a second opportunity as a head coach in the National Hockey League. And there were a lot of hashtag fire Hakstol tweets in season one. But even for me, I think it was evident that it was a good foundation that Dave was trying to build. It just maybe wasn't the right pieces at that particular time. And we saw that the Seattle Kraken got busy at the trade deadline, including getting rid of our first ever captain. And that was a financial decision, obviously, but Mark Giordano. But then you started to see how the system would play through. And then leading up to our playoff run, which we have talked about on this show, probably arrived a little bit early. But that's because there was that system and that culture that Dave Hakstol instilled, and that was really permeated through all four forward lines and the defensive pairs. And that is how the Seattle Kraken has been successful, really leaning into the culture, everything by committee.
Do you think this extension changes anything about his approach, that he has a little more security? How does this affect the way he goes about things?
I would imagine that it's similar to what Ron Francis said as a general manager, who we also extended pretty early into our off season. And that's another thing, right? Building culture and the continuity that comes with knowing that we've extended our head coach and our general manager through the 2026 season for both, as I recall, definitely for Dave Hakstol. So I think that it's got to be a confidence builder. I think there's also, or there could be, some pressure because we know what the Seattle Kraken did last year. And as I just said, probably arrived earlier than expected. And so for me, this third season for the general manager role, for the head coach role, but for the franchise overall is really going to start to show us how deeply rooted that culture, the consistency, the leadership development that's happening with the Seattle Kraken is really going to get tested in season 3.
Yeah, and now all of a sudden there's real expectations. So
exactly.
Little pressure there. You mentioned the Dunn extension. Obviously great to avoid arbitration. Certain things get said in arbitration hearings that could negatively affect the way a player feels about his employer. What does Dunn mean to the team and that extension?
Well, we've seen like a lot of players for the Seattle Kraken, Will Borgen being one of them, who we also were able to come to terms with. But that players, when they get to Seattle, for the most part, have been able to have career bests. And a part of that comes from that they weren't that number one guy on their last team, whether they came through the expansion draft, whether we picked them up on waivers, like an Ellie Tolvanen is a perfect example. And Vince Dunn fits that. The reason that I think Vince Dunn is a step ahead of even just that and that phenomenon that we've seen with the Seattle Kraken is because he also has leadership. I think he's a little bit more of what I would say is a quiet leader, lead by example kind of guy, but he showed that working hard defensively, getting on the same page with your defensive partner, his being Adam Larson, and making sure that you're not sacrificing defense while also playing into the aggressive forechecking style that the Seattle Kraken really accelerated in season 2. That was the success and the turning point for Vince Dunn and how he was able to be a more offensive defenseman for us. And so we're hoping that that will continue. But he's also a hard-nosed player. He's a grinder. He's going to work really hard. And he buys into the cultural aspect of the Seattle Kraken organization. So I think that's why he's a great fit for us to extend for 4 years. That takes us to, I believe he'll be about 30 once that contract is up. And so I'm excited to see what we can establish with an anchor, no pun intended, like Vince Dunn on the blue line.
Locked him up for his prime, so that's always good news. Any other moves you anticipate this team trying to make between now and the start of training camp?
To be honest, no. The Vince Dunn deal was the one we were looking for. There were some conversations on whether the Seattle Kraken wanted to go after an Erik Karlsson or even Nylander from Toronto, the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I do think the Seattle Kraken are going to have to figure out when is the right time to make those moves. But my gut is telling me that's not right now. With the Vince Dunn deal, he's got, 7.35 AAV. Last time I checked Cap Friendly, we had about $9 million in cap space. So unless there's some moves to take some of that salary off of the books and off of the payroll, so to speak, not off the books, off the payroll. But I don't see the Seattle Kraken making any moves before the trade deadline.
Talk to me about, this is still a new organization. Talk to me about some of the younger prospects that this team is trying to build its future around, who maybe fans should look at when training camp starts.
It's a great question, Gil, because essentially our bottom 6 got wiped out. Morgan Geekie, Daniel Sprong, and one of my absolute favorites, Ryan Donato, have signed elsewhere. And they were very impactful players. And a lot of times they were the line. They were that combination line that was really helping keep the offense afloat. So it will be players like Ty Cartier, who came up with the Seattle Kraken. He was the rookie of the year in the AHL and really started at the top of the year to turn things around in the AHL. So we'll see what he can do. Of course, Shane Wright. We still have to figure out if there will be any exemptions, because I believe he's technically one game. He's one game shy of eligibility to play in the AHL outright. But of course, what that means is if we don't get any exemption, that if he does not make the Seattle Kraken roster, then he'd have to go back to junior hockey. So that's not necessarily, we don't want to play that game again with Shane Wright, but he has definitely taken leadership steps between playing with Hockey Canada, being with the Coachella Valley Firebirds, who made their run to the Calder Cup finals. So those are 2 players for sure. I think Riker Evans is another player. And we know that this is going to be a competitive camp for the Seattle Kraken. I didn't mention goaltending, which I almost always mention. So we'll end here, Gil. Joey Decord is another player that we signed. I believe it was another 3 years that we have for Joey Decord. He's goaltender, started for the Coachella Valley Firebirds, again, leading them to the finals. But Chris Driedger will be back healthy. He was on assignment at the end of the season with the Coachella Valley Firebirds, backstopping Decord. And then, of course, we have Philip Grubauer, who really came into his own with the Seattle Kraken towards the back end of the regular season and, of course, in the playoffs. So across the board, whether it's young talent stepping up or even players like the goaltending position, where we have to see, who's going to jockey for spot 1 and spot 2 for the Kraken, and then how that impacts the Coachella Valley Firebirds. It's going to be a really exciting training camp. I can't wait to get out there to Seattle.
Lots of reasons for optimism in Seattle. Erica, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Appreciate it. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much, Gil, for having me on the Monday show, and I'll catch you again on Friday. But you can find me at elindsay08. That should be on the bottom of the screen if you're watching on YouTube. And you can, of course, find the Locked On Kraken show everywhere you find Locked On NHL, including on YouTube. Of course, you just swipe out Locked On NHL for Locked On Kraken, and that's where you can find the show.
All right, Erica, always a pleasure. Looking forward to speaking with you again on Friday.
Sounds great. Thanks, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by a product I literally use every day, AG1. Maybe you're like me, you want to be healthy and eat well, but it's always easier said than done. That's no longer the case with AG1. With one delicious scoop of AG1 in a glass of water each day, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. This special blend of ingredients supports your gut health, your nervous system, immune system, energy, recovery, focus, and aging, all these things. An AG1 costs you less than $3 a day. You're investing in your health, but it's cheaper than your cold brew habit. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/NHL Network. That's drinkag1.com/NHL Network. Check it out. It is great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Capitals, Dan Holme. And Dan, it's been an interesting offseason for the Caps, a team that hadn't missed the playoffs in a while, sort of finding themselves out of the postseason running. And their big move in the offseason was the signing of Max Pacioretty. But where exactly and when exactly is he going to fit into this lineup?
Well, the Capitals were able to get Max Pacioretty because of his Achilles issues. He's had the last couple seasons, he's had issues with that. Listen, the Caps were tight against it with the salary cap, only $888,000 and change. But Max Pacioretty 6 times in his career has scored 30 goals. That is ultimately what they're looking for out of Max Pacioretty. Alex Ovechkin carried the bulk of the mail for the Caps as far as goal scoring was concerned last year. The year before, you saw production from Tom Wilson and Evgeny Kuznetsov. They rounded out the top 3 goal scorers. That's ultimately what they were looking for. If you watched free agency, there weren't a lot of dazzling deals, I guess I would say, a lot of bargain basement type stuff. Max Pacioretty was a good deal. They got him for $2 million plus $2 million more if you meet certain incentives. I like it. I do have reservations about it. But what I've told everyone on my podcast is that if he had not had those Achilles issues, the Caps wouldn't have been able to afford him. So that is why they got him. That and Joel Edmondson were the 2 bigger moves, I guess you could say. But I'm cautiously optimistic about Max Pacioretty. If they can get any kind of production somewhat similar to that out of him, that would be really a great thing.
Do you think he'll be ready to start the season on time?
He will not be. We know that 100% for sure. He came out and said as much. Worst case scenario, it will be November. So, I mean, that will give the opportunity, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, about some prospects, their opportunity to shine in his absence. But I do think that, he will be there for a lion's share of the season. I'm just kind of keeping my fingers crossed that we can get Max Pacioretty of old and not the guy the last couple seasons that's had those major injuries.
Now, you mentioned Pacioretty. First of all, where do you think he's going to play once he's ready to come into the lineup?
I've heard, like second or third line. I guess it remains to be seen how the prospects do in training camp, that kind of thing. But they are just looking for that extra production. I guess I can't really look into a crystal ball as of yet because I want to see how everything shakes out. I still believe that Brian McClellan is going to make some big move before the start of the season. I know in order to make a move like that, you're going to have to move a piece out. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds here, but Evgeny Kuznetsov has been a guy that's been on the hot seat along with Anthony Mantha. So I guess that I would be able to give you a more accurate idea closer to the start of the season. But I kind of tend to believe that there is a bigger move up Brian McClellan's sleeve. I guess I don't know who that's going to be, as some of the bigger names like DeBrincat, I'm crossing off my list at home of potential players that they could have been. But I do think that he will probably figure to be in the second or third line.
You mentioned another move. What do you think the Caps are looking to add if they are going to make a hockey trade?
They want another big goal scorer. Ultimately at the end of the day, the blue line, I think, is pretty much solidified. They got all the big pieces, all the RFAs, the UFAs. They were taking care of the ones that were going to stay here. So that's what they're looking for, is another big time goal scorer. And one of the things that I will talk about in tomorrow's episode of my own podcast is kind of shooting for the stars. What kind of difference would a Nylander make for the Capitals? Huge. Because, where the Capitals are poised right now, I'm not feeling too optimistic. I know there was a coaching change, and sometimes you can get a bigger result out of that. But I think they need to make a huge change, similar to like a Nylander, something like that, in order to get a bigger result. The tough part, however, is in order to land someone like Nylander, like I alluded to earlier there, they only have $888,000 in cap space. They're going to have to move someone out. And what is that big piece that they're going to have to trade to get someone like a Nylander? A lot of the people, the players on the team are diminished good. Nick Backstrom 5 years ago would have been a good deal. TJ Oshie, everyone else can see the back of their hockey card. They're injury prone. That is where the whole Tom Wilson thing came in. That, wouldn't that be crazy? On my podcast, everyone's like, well, Tom Wilson, they're never going to trade a guy like that, but he retains a tremendous value. So I think that ultimately that's what it's going to be, is they're going to make a big acquisition between now and the start of the season. It's just intriguing for me to think who that will ultimately be.
Well, it's going to be certainly interesting to see. And with the cap so tight, there's not a lot of teams that have a lot of room to maneuver. Let's see what the Capitals organization can do. Talk to me about some of the younger players we alluded to earlier, who, before Max Pacioretty, for example, is ready to return, will probably get a shot at being in the lineup regularly.
So that's the thing, too. Connor McMichael, it's always been the year for Connor McMichael. Not next year, no, next year. And then when he does get his big opportunity, he ends up playing the wing. His native position is the center position. That is where he really excels. And the last couple seasons, he's been relegated to the fourth line, like left wing. That's not where he's going to excel. Next season has got to be the season that the Capitals are all in on Connor McMichael, a player that we've heard about for years. The interesting problem, however, is where does he fit up? Where does he fit? Who comes out of the lineup for him to go in? The thing that is going to be a game changer this next year is Spencer Carberry. He has that history, being that he was a coach for the Stingrays, the Hershey Bears. He knows Connor McMichael. He can take the face off the clock and look at the gears and know what kind of player he is. Also, Hendrix LaPierre, a bit of a bumpier ride for him last year, but I do think that the arrow's pointing up for him as well. Not to mention Vincent Iorio, a really great blue liner. A lot of these players are most likely going to be a couple years out. But for me, Connor McMichael, he's the guy to circle. This is his make or break season. That is my belief on him. And not to mention the bigger things that were done at the draft, So I think that, I don't know what kind of result the Capitals are going to get this next season. But if you can look to the horizon a little bit, I think this team is going to be one to be reckoned with in the Metro Division.
All right. Well, it should be interesting to see how it all plays out. Dan, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. And of course, we're available on YouTube and the SiriusXM app and wherever you find your podcasts.
Dan, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It is great to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Coyotes, Robyn Leano. And Robyn, it's a busy offseason in Arizona. Let's start with the big picture stuff. What is the latest on the arena situation out in the desert?
So we haven't heard much since the draft. The draft was the last thing we heard. Any sort of at least, I wouldn't even say substantial, but some kind of information. We heard Coyotes president and CEO Javier Gutierrez speak to the media at the draft and said, we are currently in talks of about 6 or so sites, mainly in Scottsdale, in Mesa, and in Phoenix, I think, and as well as I think Chandler, if I'm not mistaken. There's all in the east side of the Phoenix Valley. One of the rumored sites, this was not confirmed, but it's been confirmed not by the Coyotes, but by the reservation on exclusive talks on a potential piece of land on their land on the East Valley as well. So there are options, but there's nothing substantial. They do have a soft deadline for themselves to get a final deal in place, and that's by around January of 24. That's when they want to make sure they have as many things in place as possible to move forward. But other than that, nothing really substantial to really report on.
And then just to give us an idea, let's say they have their choices, lined up by January 2024. Will there be another vote necessary? What is the process? Where does it go from there?
Yeah, so the Arizona Coyotes have made it clear that they do not want to go through a public vote again. So they were going to be going through every means necessary to do that. That is one of the reasons why the Indian community is one of the options that they are currently in exclusive talks with, because that will require zero vote at all. They are, other sites include, county islands and other privately owned parcels of land that will require no vote, because it just requires just a private land sale. So they're just doing their best to make sure it doesn't go to that, because they've seen what happens if that does happen.
Well, let's hope that they are able to line up a new site and a new home soon to sort of finalize this and put it to bed. As far as the offseason is concerned on the ice, what moves do you think were the best that the team has made since the offseason started?
Oh, I think the Arizona Coyotes, that first day of free agency, I made a comment saying, if there's a winner in the first day of free agency, it's the Arizona Coyotes. I think the couple of the players I'm thinking of getting Zucker signed, as trying to think some of the other ones. Yeah, getting Nick Butstag back, getting Troy Stetcher back. They really, really went for it, and it really tells me that they are trying to move towards being a more competitive team. Are they going to be even close? Are they going to be a bubble team or a playoff team? No, but they're going to be a lot more competitive than they were in the last couple of years. I do not think we are now officially past the tanking years for the part of the rebuild for the Arizona Coyotes. They are now on the slightly bit they're ready to kind of just bump up and emerge just a little bit.
Well, that's definitely a positive sign. I mean, I know there's been a lot of draft picks also over the last couple of years. Who are some of the young people in the pipeline right now for the Coyotes that give this organization hope that they will compete soon for a playoff spot?
Yeah, I actually got a chance to go to the prospect development camp a couple weeks ago, And we got a chance to get a decent look at some of the top prospects like Logan Cooley and Sam Lipkin. Those two, I think, are the ones that are really getting a really extra attention. Those two players participated in the NCAA championship a few months ago, so like people already know their names. It's outside of that, I think, Maverick Lamoureux has kind of flown under the radar. I think he's really improved after having to miss the previous prospect development camp. I really liked seeing, I really think he's a potential to make it up there. And I really think though the Julian Lutz Julian Lutz, I want to say, like, he was a later round pick in the not this last draft, but the previous draft. And he's looked great. He looked great at camp. And I really got to say he's got a great shot. I think, fans should be excited to see him. It's going to take a couple of years still, but I think they should be excited to see him down the road.
And as far as the rest of this offseason, do you anticipate any more moves, or is this more or less where we're going to be when training camp opens up?
I think for the most part, that is where, like, they're pretty set in stone. I think they still have about one player left they do need to sign that was based off their RFAs. Or a couple, just a couple. I think they still need to sign Jack McBain. And I think that's the most important thing. Jack McBain requested arbitration from his RFA rights, and so we'll have to wait and see what comes out of that. But I think that is that's the only holdout that they were really focusing on, making sure they get done. So McBain was impressive last year, so I really think that they are going to try to do what they can to keep him.
And what position on this team do you think will take the biggest jump between last year's unit and this year's?
I really think the defense is going to take a big jump. The last couple years, the defense were not good. It was not good at all. They had Jacob Chikrin for the majority of the year, but even then he was already on his way out, so they sat him for so many games at a time. But picking up, bringing back Troy Stecher again, like I mentioned earlier, I think that was huge. Bringing in a player like Sean Dursey, what I think was absolutely huge. JJ Mosier and Yusuf Alamaki were two returning names. I think they are going to make a huge impact in this next season. They were great last season. They were absolutely amazing. So we'll see what they do this upcoming year. But I'm pretty hopeful that they're going to make a big step.
All right. Well, Robyn, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they can find the podcast and where they can find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find the podcast everywhere you get your podcast. We're also now on the SiriusXM radio app. You can follow me on social media at Robyn_Leano, and the podcast is at LO_Coyotes.
All right, Robyn, thank you so much for joining us today. Always a pleasure talking hockey with you.
Of course.
All right, I want to thank my guests. I want to thank Erica Ayala of Locked On Kraken, Dan Holme of Locked On Capitals, and Robyn Leano of Locked On Coyotes for joining me today. Also want to thank everyone for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Everydayers, every day, Monday through Friday, we have the biggest stories from around the NHL right here on Locked On NHL. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Have a great day, everybody, and thank you so much for listening and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.